Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals in GT Sport, and it's been about 3 months actually since we last did one of these, which was a Rivals match between the Ford Raptor and the Toyota Tundra. This time a very highly requested rivalry between the newly debuted Camaro ZL1 1LE and the Nissan GT-R NISMO edition. Pretty obvious rivalry and a very good one as well. Both cars offer a huge amount of spec for the money, they're both very popular, they come from the classic rivalry of muscle versus JDM or muscle versus import, and more applicably, they are both track-focused hardcore variants of existing good cars, the GT-R and the Camaro. So what we're going to do is take them both around the track. They are both tuned to the same level, N600 with roughly the same power and weight, both on super soft tyres with no traction control, but also no tuning. I have not adjusted any of the actual settings, just to see what the car can do in its pure form. Then, once we've done that, we're going to compare the on-paper spec, both in stock and fully tuned form, to see which one is objectively better, but also which one feels better, which one performs better, and crucially of course, which one is actually faster around the track. First up then we have the newcomer. The Camaro ZL1 1LE is, I will say straight off the bat, definitely, and to me without any question whatsoever, the car that takes more skill to drive fast and especially to push to its limits of these two. The GT-R, as I've said a number of times, does so much of the work for you that it feels like you're not even going as fast as you actually are, and although that's great from a lap time and racing point of view, it depends what kind of driving experience you want, because with the Camaro it feels more hardcore, more authentic, and more old school, which in some ways it is. Of course you do not have all-wheel drive, and even though the 1LE is of course more focused and track-oriented than the normal ZL1, it's still a muscle car at heart, so of course it's rear-wheel drive, it's very powerful, it's gonna get the tail out, so to get a good lap time out of it, it's simply going to take more effort. My overall thoughts on the Camaro, to lay all of my cards on the table immediately, are I definitely like it more out of the two cars. Thankfully though, that actually makes no difference to these tests because it's all about the numbers, be it lap time or the on-paper spec, so personal preference doesn't really mean that much. I will say though that it was definitely easier to get a better lap out of the GT-R than it was out of the Camaro. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just something that you need to bear in mind. Moving on then to the GT-R, well of course, you know what you're getting when it comes to the GT-R, especially the Nismo. Even as far back as Gran Turismo 6, it was hugely popular, very good performance car, some would even argue the fastest street car in the game, and in terms of its track performance, well again, the GT-R routes, the Skyline routes, it's a dominant force for a reason. Street racing, rally racing, drag racing, drifting even, and of course multiple forms of racing from Le Mans to Super GT and everything in between. It's a great car. The GT-R NISMO is probably the closest thing that the GT-R has ever been to a true supercar, and some would argue that the GT-R is a supercar. It's not. Nissan calls it a super sports car, and I've always agreed with that. This one is very close to being a full-on supercar though, in a similar way to how the Viper ACR and Corvette ZR1 do as well. In the comparison between these two, well, unfortunately for the GT-R, it kind of loses one of the biggest edges that an R35 usually has, and that is value for money. It's very expensive. This version is 187,000 credits, and that's European money. Now, I'm not saying that it's not worth that, but usually a GT-R would be like 70, 80, 90 grand. This is a lot more than that. In fact, compared to the Camaro, it's far more than double the price. And again, that's something to bear in mind. What's not up for debate though is that the GT-R was quicker. Out of the two cars, the Camaro did a lap time of 2 minutes 9.7, the GT-R did a 2 minute 8.2, so it's not even all that close. Both of them tuned to the limits of N600 with the same weight, as I said, both using sport softs with no traction control, and I haven't adjusted any of the other settings at all. No suspension, no gearbox, no diff tuning, none of that. So, interesting, the GT-R is definitely quicker and, by a serious amount, it's also more consistent. With the Camaro you have to focus a lot more and put a lot more effort into driving, whereas with the GT-R, it's a walk in the park. It's like driving an Audi R8 or a BMW M3, they kind of do a lot of the work for you. What then, of course, about the specs? Well, let's find out. First of all then, let's talk stock specs, and then afterwards, of course, we will get to the fully tuned performance. Now, the pricing is not even close. As I said, of course, the Camaro gets the win. Even against lower level GTRs, it is still cheaper at a fraction under 80 grand to the almost, Porsche GT3 level price of the GT-R of 187,000. Engine-wise, well, of course, biggest is not always best. In fact, quite often it's the opposite in racing, but as I've said before, in these Rivals matches we go by basically top trumps rules where biggest is usually best, so under those rules we will of course be giving the Camaro a point, but of course take that with a pinch of salt. As far as power though, once again, very clear win for the Camaro. 591 for the GT-R is not bad by any stretch. 649 though is a whole lot more. In fact, that's more than a Lamborghini Murcielago SV, which is serious territory for a Camaro. As far as torque as well, the GT-R is good, it's very respectable, 481 pound-feet. The Camaro though completely obliterates that with 641. Not really any surprises there though, it's American muscle, so of course. As far as weight, interestingly, they are close, very close, only 8 kilos separates the two. But the Camaro does win. The 8 kilos is in favour of the ZL1 at 1732 to the 1740 of the Nismo. As far as horsepower per tonne, well, it's lighter and more powerful, so of course the Camaro wins there with 375 to the 340 of the Nismo. Interestingly though, the final category of our stock specs is the lowest class you can tune the car to. So technically not stock, but close to it. In other words, lower than stock. This, I think, is a very valid thing because it tells you what the lower end potential of the car is. Can you detune it and use it in lower classes? And this is interesting because the GT-R gets a point. It can indeed go down to N500. The Camaro cannot. It's close, but it cannot. So the lowest for the Camaro is N600, and that's a very important point for the GT-R to get because, if you've been following along, of course, that's the only point that the Nismo has. The Camaro dominated everything. Price, engine, power, torque, weight, and horsepower per tonne all go to the Camaro, and only the lower end category potential goes to the Nismo. So that's interesting how it goes in the stock performance. And once again, as we often see, the car that is superior on paper, the Camaro, by a huge margin, is actually slower on the track, and that happens a lot in Rivals matches. What then about when they're tuned though? Because GT-Rs and Camaros are both very receptive to aftermarket tuning, so it could change everything. Well, let's consider. Of course, the price and the engine size do not change, so we'll skip forward to power first of all. Well, as any of you who recently checked my updated top 10 most powerful cars in the game list will know, of course, the Camaro gets the win because it's the 9th most powerful car in GT Sport currently, with 1,007 horsepower. The GT-R again is great, it's not too far behind. In fact, the fully tuned power is closer in terms of difference than the stock power, but it's still not close enough. As far as torque as well, not too surprisingly, the Camaro dominates once again with a huge 993 pound-feet to again the perfectly respectable 803 of the Nismo, but again, it's not even close, around 200 pound-feet more gives the Camaro yet another point. As far as weight, well, it was already lighter to begin with, and it stays that way when tuned. 1454 kilos for the Camaro, 1479 for the GT-R. So again, not exactly a small margin. In fact, what was 8 kilos becomes a lot more when you tune them, the difference between the two. And of course, the horsepower per tonne remains in favour of the ZL1 at almost 700 to the 668, so quite far behind on the GT-R. So interesting. What then about the class? Because of course the GT-R had lower end potential. Well, interestingly, the GT-R doesn't have an advantage now because they both have an upper end potential, of course, of the highest power class in the game, N1000. So interestingly, both stock and tuned, the Camaro completely dominates. It has all of the points, and the only advantages that the GT-R has are the lower end class, basically, where you can take it down to N500, and the only other place that it even gets a look in is because they both can be tuned up to N1000, so they both get an equal point. Apart from that, that's literally the only points that the Nismo has to its name, and all in all that means that the Camaro gets 11 points to 2 for the Nismo. But the lap times speak for themselves. 209.7 for the Camaro, 208.2 for the GT-R. So once again, it's a classic reversal switch in these Rivals matches between on paper and reality of driving. Which one do you prefer? For me, as I said, I am more of a Camaro fan. The GT-R is getting a bit long in the tooth, and although it's still great, it is by far the OP choice. Very oversaturated in racing. The Camaro is the fresh new thing, so of course many of us like it. Whether or not that will stay the case will be seen, but I like it. I like the more raw approach that the Camaro has. I love the amount of power it has, the amount of skill that it requires and demands to get a better lap out of it. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Interesting to see how the Rivals match panned out. Tell me your thoughts down below. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.